So if you've seen any malware analysis videos on YouTube, you'll most likely notice that they're usually on Microsoft Windows. And that's for a reason. Windows is the most popular operating system in the world, and therefore malware targets it the most. So you'll often see security researchers and malware analysts going through various tools like you see on the screen here. In this case, we are in a Flare VM from FireEye, and it offers many great tools. Anything from networking, memory analysis, file analysis, etc. But sometimes we need to move to other operating systems, like Linux, due to the availability of frameworks or existing tools. But it's often a hard transition to look into Linux distros because there's so many out there. For example, you can go to distrowatch.com, and that is a listing of Linux distros out there, sorted by popularity and rankings. So what I like to do is once a year do a little experiment, and I'll look at around the top 50 Linux distributions, and I'll download, install them, and check them out. And that's just to see, what's out there, how have they changed, what are they providing to us. So here I'll go over a lot of the major distributions as well as some lesser known ones, and find which ones are more well suited for development, reverse engineering, and vulnerability research. So first up is Ubuntu Kylin. This is a distribution that is sanctified by the Chinese government. It is built for the Chinese government. I believe at one point it was built by one of their military institutions. And it's running the UK UI desktop, which they also develop. You can run this desktop on other distributions, but it takes quite a bit of setup to actually get it working correctly because it's primarily built for the Chinese audience and their language, their character sets, etc. So it breaks a lot of things sometimes. It's on the heftier side of resource usage, sitting at 876 at idle, and we're looking at about 102 tasks being run at idle as well. The CPU utilization is fine, but yeah, so a little on the hefty side, not too bad. One quality of life thing that I always look for is being able to drag binaries onto reverse engineering tools like Cutter. And you see here that this desktop environment does not allow you to do that. So I'd have to go in and modify some things, manually create desktop shortcuts. Not even sure if that works in this. But yeah, so being on the hefty side for resource usage, not being able to have certain little quality of life things. Their desktop environment sometimes breaks in VMs and things like this. The start menu kind of showing up over here. That doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. And the fact that it's geared more towards a Chinese audience, specifically the Chinese government, there are some concerns there. So even though it's a really pretty desktop environment for a Linux distribution, it's one I have to pass on. Distribution is called Deepin. Deepin is another Linux distribution that is geared towards the Chinese audience. The desktop environment that they run is called Deepin. It's a very pretty environment. It's laid out very nicely. The theming is very nice. It's pretty light on resource usage. We're sitting at 544 megabytes. That's great. Each top, looking at 88 tasks running, under 2% utilization on the CPUs. That's fantastic as well. Yeah, everything's pretty good. Because it is kind of geared more towards the Chinese audience, some things do break sometimes because of localization. It's not always perfect. But that's just something you run into with Linux. The quality of life feature that I look for, dragging binaries onto reverse engineering tools, that is something that this desktop environment does not allow you to do. So there would need to be further customizations there or manual creation of desktop shortcuts and things to actually get that to work. But yeah, since there's localization issues sometimes with this, and some of the quality of life features would need to be tweaked for something like this, and the App Store not having as many packages as could be available, because of the localization and targeted audience, Deepin is one that I have to pass on as well. There's a very pretty distribution called ElementaryOS. If we look at the resources, you can see that cold boot sitting at 668 megs. That's great. I believe ElementaryOS uses the Pantheon desktop environment, and we're sitting at 97 tasks running on cold. It's a little high, but the memory and CPU utilization is still down quite a bit, so that's okay. The thing I really don't like about Elementary, even though it's a beautiful desktop environment, is how stripped down they have everything. One of my biggest complaints about Linux is that it offers too much customization, and that is true for 98% of the distros out there. ElementaryOS went the complete opposite way, and they locked down a lot. You got to put in some effort to undo a lot of the locking that they've done. For example, on the desktop here, if you right click, much like Budgie, the desktop environment, you don't have any options. And the reason you don't have any options specifically on this desktop environment is because you can't have desktop icons. Well, why? Why can't, I get that they're going for a very clean setup and everything, but restricting something as simple as that is very odd. Now, there are ways you can get around that. You can install packages, you can manually modify the Pantheon desktop environment to allow you to have those things, but that's just a very large quality of life thing that's just missing. So I can't create quick folders, I can't create shortcuts, I can't have access to my readily available tools, even though I can put them down here in this dock. That is true. Yeah, I need to be able to interact with the desktop. So for those reasons, even though it's a very pretty desktop, I would highly recommend this for anybody who maybe not as Linux savvy. So if you're giving this to a parent as an option, or a friend who's not very computer savvy, I think this distro is great. But for anybody trying to do any kind of analysis or programming or anything in depth even at all, I wouldn't go with this OS. So that's a pass from me. So Solus is our next distribution, and it's a bit of an odd one. Whereas most Linux distributions are based on something, either grandfather Debian or the offshoot of Ubuntu, Red Hat, etc. Solus is kind of its own thing. They went off and created their own branch of Linux. And they're using a desktop environment which they have created called Budgie. It's a very pretty desktop environment. It's very responsive. They have a lot of neat features. Pretty low on resource usage, 592 megs just sitting at idle on a cold boot. If we go into HTOP, we can see that 86 tasks are running by default, so resource utilization is great. One thing I don't like about Budgie is if you right click like the desktop, you get like two options. So quality of life of creating folders and files and shortcuts, getting properties of things, you can't even get properties of files on the desktop. And the quality of life thing that I always look for, again, being able to drag binaries to reverse engineering tools, does not work. So there would need to be customization that goes into this desktop environment, which I really don't want to do every full upgrade. Also, because Solus is its own thing, you don't have access to as many repositories. A lot of tools break because they have their own kind of thing going on, which is good, but it's also pretty frustrating if you can't find a dependency that you need for a tool. So for those reasons, Solus is not really on my list of go-to distributions. Furthermore, all of the distributions that you'll see today are not just in virtual environments. I have a dedicated laptop where I've hard installed every single one of these, and Solus, it does not play nicely with other distributions. They do their own thing to their boot manager, and for whatever reason, other boot managers are unable to detect it, and its boot manager is unable to play nicely with those other installs. So if you're planning on dual booting with, Windows, Mac, and a Linux distribution or something, Solus has a lot of issues dealing with that. So for those reasons, again, Solus is out for me. So the next Linux distribution we have is CentOS. I'm not going to go too in-depth in this one. CentOS is great for a server environment, but server environments are very different than workstation environments. I had the pleasure of using CentOS for a 6-month course where we had to use it as our daily driver for non-server work, so just normal coursework in reverse engineering and things, and programming, and it was awful every single day. Very much dislike it. On a cold boot, it runs by default the GNOME desktop, so you're looking at 1.2 gigs in resource usage, which is ridiculous. CPU usage hovers around 1%, just doing nothing, just running just the resource monitor. Yeah, there's really no reason to use CentOS as a daily driver workstation. There's just so many other distros out there that provide more features and usability. Again, CentOS is great for servers and stability and solid packages, but it's just really not geared towards day-to-day usage. So that's hard pass from me. And again, 6 months of using this for daily coursework, specifically for reverse engineering and development and things. Do not recommend. So next up we have Fedora. Fedora is along the same lines of CentOS. It's kind of in the Red Hat distro area, so more server focused, but Fedora is like their kind of workstation offering. And they use Fedora as a test bed for a lot of the features and packages and everything before they actually get ported over to Red Hat and CentOS and things like that, because they want to test them out. Red Hat and CentOS and other server distributions are meant to be very stable, rock solid. So Fedora gets a lot of those bleeding edge kind of packages and things that get tested out. And because of that, a lot of times there's a lot of updates for Fedora. So every time you log in, you're looking at 200-300 megs of downloads like every couple days, and it just gets annoying. You can configure those things to, hey, only show these once a week or this, that, and the other, but it's just not really necessary. The resource utilization on this is also pretty high. It uses GNOME by default as the desktop environment, and it's sitting around 1 gig on a little over 1 gig on a cold boot, and it's running 122 tasks. That's a lot. I don't know why it's so high or what they're running, but that is certainly on the high side. So unless you need access to bleeding edge packages, or you just like messing around in a Red Hat environment, just like if you need that for some reason, Fedora could be good for you. But for the average user just looking to develop and reverse engineer and things, I would pass on this. So our next distribution is Debian, the granddaddy of just about everything out there. I'll preface this quick review with I love Debian, but for everyday use, I cannot recommend it. It is a solid distribution. It's, again, the granddaddy of everything, but the amount of effort that you need to do to set this up properly and get simple things like third-party drivers and things for Wi-Fi and networking, configure third-party package repos, and just going a little lax on security so that you can get things done a little bit easier. There's just a lot that you have to do, and there's really no reason to need to do that for a daily driver distribution. By default, it uses the GNOME desktop. You can install other desktops, of course, but by default, GNOME is kind of what's there. 730 megs, cold boot, looking at 99 tasks. A little on the high side, but the resource usage of CPU utilization and memory is fairly low. But because of all of the additional setup and knowledge that you need to actually configure this thing, I can't recommend it for a daily driver. It's too much of a pain just to, if you just want to get something done. So that, even though I love Debian, grandfather of everything, gotta pass on that for a daily driver for developing and reverse engineering. So our next Linux distribution comes with a caveat. So there is a site called distrowatch.com, and it has a ranking of Linux distributions, and it'll show you popularity rankings from the community for the past 3 months, 6 months to a year. All of a sudden MX Linux popped up on this list, and not only did it pop up, but it took the #1 spot for the last 3, 6, and 12 months. And that's above other very, very widely distributed distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Debian, and it was very odd of how it popped up like that. Well, DistroWatch is a little misleading in that they rank things not based on downloads or community feedback, but on page hits. So if you're well adapted to the Linux community and you all of a sudden see MX Linux pop up on a list, you're going to click on it to see what is this thing. So that's kind of a little skewed as to why their popularity is so, bolstering on the lists. Now, that's not to say it's a bad distribution. It's a very good distribution. They base their distro off of Debian. They try to stay as close to Debian as they can, so they don't base it on Ubuntu or other forks. They have their, own thing kind of going on, trying to stay as pure as they can. By default, they run the XFCE window manager, which is great. It's very low on resources. On a cold boot, we're looking at 510 megs, running about 97 tasks, and very low CPU utilization. So that's great. Of note is that they have a welcome center, and in their welcome center, they have what's called an MX tool suite, and these are tools built by the MX team that help you do everyday things. Very handy things like cleaning up your system or making a live USB or changing your boot options or repairing grub. And these are, again, all created by the MX team. So the MX team and the community, very clearly very passionate about Linux. They are doing everything they can to make this distro great. But because they are based on Granddaddy Debian, a lot of the packages that you get for this distro are often lagging behind quite a bit. And you run into some dependency issues for certain tools. But other than that, yeah, it's a good distro. It's pretty solid. You have, typical XFCE menu here, which allows you to interact with the desktop, create launchers, folders, all that stuff. That's great. The XFCE environment that they've done, pretty standard. Yeah, but because of the potential for package issues, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for daily driving for development and reverse engineering and things, but it's also not the worst distribution out there for it either. So next up, we have a distro called FerenOS. This is a fairly newer distro on the market, and it is by default running the Plasma KDE environment, slightly modified as you see, with some translucency, and they've modified the start menu a little bit, but it is still based on KDE, and because of that, it's fairly light on resource usage. If we look at the resources, so we're looking at about 800 megs. That's actually kind of high. Maybe it's doing some kind of update in the background. We're getting updates, and the tasks are a little high as well. We're running about 101. So maybe it's not as light as I remember. KDE is normally pretty light. But yeah, Typical KDE things. Right-click the desktop, you can add things, add widgets and panels, and create new things. This link to applications is good. That's one of the quality of life things that I like to see, is being able to add quick desktop shortcuts to applications. And the KDE environment does allow dragging binaries onto reverse engineering tools like IDA and Cutter, and it will open them for you. So you don't always have to go File, Open, and browse to your file. Feren is based on Debian, so you get the typical apt install for packages and things. Yeah, overall it's a decent distro. It's not one I'm particularly fond of, just because it's so new, and a lot of updates coming in, and their modification of KDE comes with its own problems sometimes of requiring more updates than maybe you necessarily want. So yeah, for those reasons, I kind of skip it. But if it's your cup of tea, there's certainly nothing overtly wrong with this distribution. So our next Linux distribution is called Zorin. Interesting name, and it's a very pretty distribution. It is based on GNOME, an older version of GNOME, but everything about it is just it's very pretty. It's very well laid out. If you're coming from Windows or something, you're going to find yourself right at home. Translucency of the menus and the modifications that they've done with GNOME are very nice. Unfortunately, that translates into a pretty hefty operating system. It's pretty chunky on the resources. Memory, is usually around 900 plus, and then tasks being over, 100 at 111. That is pretty hefty, just doing nothing. CPU utilization is down, but still having that many tasks is on the hefty side for most Linux distros. One quality of life thing that doesn't really translate very well is dragging and dropping of binaries to app images or app image shortcuts, which is a bummer, because this distribution is fairly well laid out. Things are fairly nice in it, but having those types of quality of life things that aren't really there, combined with a high resource usage and running older versions of GNOME that don't have, like GNOME 40, like the Wayland gestures and things that you can do with the trackpad nowadays, it's kind of a bummer. So while it's not, a bad distribution by any means, there are certainly more that are more out there that are more well suited towards development, reverse engineering, and just being general usability without having to, manually create the desktop shortcuts, or having older versions of software, or having the heavy resource usage that this uses. But if you wanted to recommend this to a user who's not necessarily as well adept into Linux, much like ElementaryOS, I think this option is a much better alternative to something like that. Whereas Elementary is much more locked down, Zorin is opened up quite a bit more. You can include things on the desktop, so you can create things. You can modify a lot more of the settings a lot easier. But for daily driving of reverse engineering and things, I would probably pass. So our next Linux distro is called Linux Lite, and it's meant to be a light version of Linux. So you can run it on old hardware, and it's supposed to have low resource utilization, so that you can run it on those old machines and still get some performance out of them. For such a supposedly light distribution, it's running XFCE for the desktop environment, but it sits at around 620 megs on boot, which is still low, don't get me wrong. But for a distribution that is attempting to be light, that's really not that light. I would expect light to be around 350 megs or lower. So I'm not real sure why it has so much utilization. but it does, even outside of a VM. So if it's hard booted on a machine, it's the same type of scenario. So generally willing to skip out on some quality of life improvements and things if the resource utilization is a lot lower. But since this is still pretty high, I would expect other quality of life things to be available. And unfortunately, XFCE doesn't really offer those a lot of times. You have to do some customization to do them, like dragging and dropping of binaries onto reverse engineering tools. Again, that's just something that I always test, because that's just something that gets used so often and speeds up work so much that it's just something that you need. So if a desktop environment doesn't allow you to do that out of the box, it's kind of a ding from me, just because then you have to go in and manually create them, and yeah, which can be done, but again, it's a hassle to do it. But yeah, other than that, other than the resource utilization being a little high for something that's supposed to be light, there's really nothing too wrong with this distro. It's just lacking some of the features of other distributions because it's trying to be lighter, but unfortunately it really doesn't hit that mark too much nowadays. And we'll see another distribution later on that does hit that mark in spades and does it much better than this distribution. So for general development and reverse engineering, especially if you're looking for lighter resource distributions, I wouldn't really recommend Linux Lite. There's another distribution later that we'll look at that's much better. So our next distribution is called ParrotOS. It's not a very well-known distribution, but it is very much akin to Kali Linux, if you've heard of that. And it is aimed to be a security distribution. So it has a whole bunch of pre-installed tools for doing various security related things like pen testing or auditing Wi-Fi development, things like that. So it comes with all of these prepackaged tools that's supposed to help you get you on your way and have all of those for you to play around with. By default, it comes with the Mate desktop environment, which is decent on resources. Mate is supposed to be a lot lighter on resources, so this one out of the box, just the modifications that they've done to the system and things, has it running a little hot on resources, about 700-ish megs on a cold boot, and 77 task running. Task running is actually pretty good. 700 megs is a little hot for the Mate environment, I think, even in a virtual machine. But yeah, so with the Mate environment, by default, you can't drag and drop binaries onto desktop shortcuts. You also can't, I don't believe, oh no, you can. In Mate, you can create launchers. So launchers, this is a great thing in any distro, and I love it when they actually have this, because you can create desktop launchers to applications, which is very handy for creating shortcuts to reverse engineering tools like IDA and Cutter and Ghidra and all these things, so that you can just drag your current project onto that and open things up very easy without having to navigate through the file system. Again, it's kind of a dumb thing, but it's also something that saves a lot of time, so it's something that is pretty valuable to have. But by default, I don't believe that dragging and dropping of the binary onto those desktop shortcuts actually opens the file, which is unfortunate. That paired with the resource utilization being a little hot in this distro, and the fact that these types of distros come with all of these pre-installed tools, means that the amount of updates that come along with these types of distros, I mean, you can have 300, 400, 500 megs every couple days coming down for these different distros that are downloading databases or updates to the tools or security updates. If you don't need all of these tools, it's really not worth having. And in my opinion, ParrotOS while they're doing a decent job and trying to offer something, an alternative to Kali Linux, I think Kali Linux far exceeds everything that they're doing in just about every single way. So for me, using this as a daily driver for programming, reverse engineering, and things would be a pass from me. So our next distribution is called OpenSuse, or OpenSuse. Interesting distro. It's kind of its own thing-ish. Yeah, by default it comes with the KDE Plasma desktop environment. That's what they have kind of a custom-ish thing going on for. And by default, on cold boot, let's see here. Oop. Yeah, for some reason we're looking at like 900 megs. That seems really hot for resource utilization. Normally on hardware boots, so not in a VM, I get this running 600-ish, 650, 700 maybe. But yeah, the test running 76, that's pretty low. So not real sure why it's sitting so high on memory utilization right now. Could be because it's downloading updates in the background, getting ready to install. But yeah, so because it's using KDE, it comes with an immense amount of customization options, which for a daily driver I really don't care about for working. I just want to be able to do my work and not worry about, do I have the correct shade of red on my window title bars or something like that. I really don't care. I want to be able to interact with the desktop. I want to be able to create files and folders easily, drag and drop icons and binaries and open them up in reversing tools. KDE does allow you to do that by creating links to applications, which is fantastic. But all the other options just, well, the menu isn't showing up right now for some reason. Yeah, not sure why. One of the things that OpenSuse does have that the community, either they love it or they don't care about it, is something called YAST. YAST is like a system management tool. It allows you to do an immense amount of things to manage your system, like anything from networking, security of the system, user administration, things like that. And by that I mean normal Linux distros have that as well, but YAST takes that to the extreme a little bit. They allow you to do so much customization and management of your system that it's a little overwhelming. For sysadmins and people who are using this in like a corporate environment, that could be great. But if you're just a researcher or developer that just needs to do a job to get something done, it's really kind of overkill for what you need. So because of that, because of the kind of high resource usage that we see sometimes with this, because their modifications to the KDE Plasma doesn't always work as intended, and because I've had window manager issues with certain GUI applications or like Java applications and things, OpenSuse would be a pass from me for daily driving of development and reverse engineering. Alright, so our next distribution is called EndeavourOS. And this is where we make our way into the, I use Arch by the way, territory. Endeavour is using the XFCE desktop environment. Again, it's Arch based, so you can use the Pacman package manager, which is great. It's great at threading out and getting packages installed very quickly. By default, okay, apparently we don't have htop. On a cold boot of the system, it looks like we are using, where are we at here? So about 640-ish megs on a cold boot, so not too bad with the XFCE desktop manager. yeah, so pretty light on resources. One thing that I don't particularly like about the Arch systems for a daily driver of, you know, just I need to get work done of development and reverse engineering and things, is having access to bleeding edge package repositories, which Arch is known for. We really don't need that. And I'm not one to want my system constantly being updated. Now you can push those updates back. You can, you know, say, hey, only bug me once a week or something for those updates, but you're still going to be inundated by all of these security updates and things coming into the system for all of these, you know, bleeding edge packages, and it's just something you don't really need. On top of that, EndeavourOS, when you first install it, there are an immense number of options to install this thing, which, I mean, can be good, can be bad. I lean more towards the bad side because, much like Linus Torvalds, I just want to get in, I just want to do work. I don't want to be bothered by the operating system. So unfortunately, out of all of the Arch distros that we have on the list today, EndeavourOS is kind of my least favorite. There's nothing particularly wrong with it. It's still a good distro and all that. Again, have access to XFCE so you can create launchers. By default, I don't believe you can drag and drop binaries to reverse engineering tools and have them open, so you have to do a little bit of customization there. Other than that, decent OS, but I think there's better distros out there for the development and reverse engineering work. So our next distro is probably in the running for one of the best looking distros out there, and that is Garuda Linux. Garuda Linux is I use Arch, by the way, territory as well. And they, by default, well, one of their default distros is their KDE Dragonized edition, and that's what we're looking at now. It's a pretty heavily modified version of KDE Plasma. By default, their resource usage is a little on the high side, memory-wise, just to run all of these, you know, effects and things on the window managers. We're sitting at around 3% CPU utilization, just kind of at idle, not doing anything. We're also sitting at about 800 megs, which is, it's actually a little lower than I normally see this. Normally it's hovering around a gig, which is pretty high. And that's both in and out of a VM. The number of tasks running, 66, that's pretty good. But again, because of all these effects and things, pretty high on CPU, idle, and memory. Because it is using KDE Plasma, we have the traditional KDE right-click. We can create new links to applications, which again, something I really like. That allows you to create shortcuts to reverse engineering tools like Cutter and IDA, Ghidra. And then drag and drop does work out of the box for dragging a binary onto those shortcuts and opening them in those tools, and that saves a lot of time. Yeah, other than that, because it is Arch, you do have to deal with the bleeding edge repositories, which offers a lot more updates than a lot of other distros, so you may be nagged by updates quite a bit and have to download quite a bit of updates, which gets in the way of work quite often. Even though you can push those off, you know, you got to configure that, and then even then, by the time it reaches you, you're still going to have an accumulation of updates to install, which is a little annoying. But other than that, I would say it's pretty good. Their GNOME edition is also pretty well suited, and it comes with GNOME 40 by default now, which has access to Wayland, so that allows you to use trackpad gestures, so like 3 fingers swiping between workspaces and things, which helps out your workflow quite a bit. Yeah, other than that, great distro, looks great. A little heavy on the resources, a little heavy on the updates because of Arch, but yeah, it could be a contender for maybe using it, you know, day in and day out for reverse engineering and development. So our next distribution is Manjaro Linux, which we are still in the territory of, I use Arch, by the way. It's more packages, cool. So on cold boot, the resource usage 814 megs, 71 tasks. It's a little high, especially considered we're using XFCE. Not sure why it's so high. Even outside of a VM, it's still kind of up there. Yeah, not real sure why. For development and reverse engineering, using XFCE, we have access to creating launchers, which is always good for, again, being able to drag those binaries onto reverse engineering tools and open them up. Not entirely sure if that works by default. I think you may have to make a slight tweak in order to actually open those. But you can create the launchers, which is a nice quality of life feature. Menus and everything for Manjaro are fine. Nothing crazy flashy. The theme in the terminal is nice. The resource utilization is of slight concern. Just using a lot for not really any reason. And one thing you have to be aware of with any Arch distribution is the use of bleeding edge packages, which means they have very, very, very up-to-date software. A little too up-to-date oftentimes. You can, sometimes break things. And the amount of updates that come to the system are usually pretty high. You can delay those, but you're still going to accumulate those updates that need to be installed. For that reason, I would say Manjaro is probably the most stable of the Arch distros. I would equate it to like the Ubuntu of the Arch distros, I guess. But with Arch, again, because they're using all the bleeding edge software, I've run into quite a few issues with launching different RE reverse engineering tools or IDEs for software development and things. So while it's a good distro, if you want to stick with Arch, I would highly recommend Manjaro. But just Arch in general for this type of development, I think, becomes very, very burdensome of keeping up with the updates and tweaks and fixing things and all the manual labor that goes into it, which, if that's your thing, great. But when I get into a system, like I want to work. I don't want to have to fuss around with the system. I want to do the work. So for that, wouldn't necessarily recommend Manjaro for that, but if you want to stick with Arch, I would highly recommend it. So our next distribution is called PopOS, and I think the majority of the community agrees that that's a very dumb name for a distribution. But despite that, it's actually pretty good. Now, if you follow along with Linus Tech Tips on YouTube, you'll know about their recent fiasco with PopOS. Very long story short, they had a challenge to switch from Windows to Linux and use it for 30 days as their daily computer. Linus tried to install PopOS. He did so successfully, but tried to install Steam, and it popped up with a bunch of basically instructions that he didn't understand in the terminal, and he did them, and it uninstalled his entire desktop manager, the window manager, everything, and dumped him into a terminal. That, not an unreasonable thing for him to do. As a new Linux user, he just didn't understand what was being presented to in front of him, as most Linux, newer Linux users, they wouldn't know. This was confirmed by PopOS to be a bug. They fixed the bug, and everything should be good to go. But little things like that tend to happen with newer distributions, which PopOS is. Now, they do have support of like System 76 behind them, as using PopOS as their default OS on their laptops, which is good to see. And having that kind of support will allow them to continue developing and continuing making PopOS better. But for the features of PopOS, it is a modified GNOME, pretty heavily modified. As you see here, the launcher and the theming of it is a little bit different than GNOME. Resource-wise is pretty hefty, sitting at 814 megs, 107 tasks. That's pretty hefty for Linux distro on a cold boot. And that's in part due to the theming and modifications that they've done to GNOME. One nice thing about PopOS is that they do include a tiling manager. For those that don't know what that is, tiling manager will automatically tile your active windows that you have open. So over here we have the terminal, and over here we have the file manager. And this can be especially useful for development and reverse engineering. You could have one side be an IDE for something you're programming. On the other side you could have the disassembly for the binary that you built, or you could have debugging, etc. So that's a really nice feature to have, just kind of pre-built in. Now I know you can install tiling managers on any Linux distro out there, I get it. But this is installed by default, it's configured, it's easily disabled, hotkeys are already set up for it, and the least amount of configuration that I need to do so that I can focus on the tasks that I need to perform, the better. And having the option to intelligently hide the dock down at the bottom is also a good feature. Because it is GNOME, you don't have a menu to automatically create desktop shortcuts. You can, again, configure that yourself, but that is a little more configuration that you need to do. Because of the resource usage being on the hefty side, not having a couple quality of life things like the desktop icons, again, I know that's not a super big deal, but it helps out immensely while reverse engineering things. That and them just being a newer distro and kind of prone to bugs, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for a daily driver just yet. They have some things on the horizon. They're trying to get away from GNOME and create their own desktop environment, coded out in Rust. So we'll see what the future has to hold for them. But for right now, good distro. I think there's some better out there, but you certainly couldn't go wrong with trying this out. I think it has some really good features for the development and reverse engineering aspects for a layout. So our next distro is Ubuntu. Could be a lot of hate in the comments for it, could be a lot of love. It's a mixed bag. But Ubuntu is a reality that anybody in this space, you have to deal with it. Ubuntu is a solid distribution. It is probably the most widely distributed distribution around the world, and the one that is used the most by organizations and individuals everywhere. If you are developing software or tools, most often those are going to be developed on an Ubuntu system and configured with dependencies and libraries that are available to Ubuntu. Specifically, you'll see things like, this tool was built on Ubuntu 16.04 long-term, release with, XYZ libraries of version blah, and that's where that tool needs to run. You'll see that a lot in this field, especially if you're getting tools from GitHub that are developed by, just individuals. You'll see that a lot as being a requirement. So yeah, Ubuntu has a little bit of a checkered past. Because they are so popular, they attempted to monetize in a way that the community found out about and was not very happy with. What they did was, when they switched over to the Unity desktop environment that they're trying to go for, they started including Amazon shortcuts and things, and specifically the Unity desktop, when you would search for things and it would search the web as well, it would send your search results out to Amazon, and then Amazon would have your analytics ID and things, and get this profile of you as to what you've been searching on, and then they could interject ads into your traffic and search results, trying to target you to get you to buy things that are of your interest. The Linux community found out about that and were rightfully extremely pissed off, because that goes against pretty much everything Linux stands for. Ubuntu subsequently, kind of got rid of that feature. They've apologized immensely since then. It's been a long time since that happened, but the Linux community is still pretty scorned from that. And that's why you see a lot of the hatred towards Ubuntu. But like I said, love it or hate it, Ubuntu is something that is a reality, and there is no getting away from it in this community. So, all that aside, it is based on GNOME. Normally running this desktop with this little sidebar over here. You can get rid of it with some customization. It is running GNOME 40, which gives you access to Wayland, which allows you to use gestures through your touchpad, meaning you can use 3 fingers to swipe between workspaces and things like that. Resource-wise, a little on the hefty side, about 900 megs on a cold boot, 108 tasks being run. That's just because the environment's just pretty hefty. Just sitting at idle, not doing anything. The reason I'm not a fan of that is because those resources could be used for other things. Now, I know systems nowadays you can get up to, an immense amount of RAM, and you can get crazy processors and things, but every little bit counts, especially if you're trying to turn a machine into like a fuzzing platform or a batch binary analysis platform. Like, every little bit counts. So when you have unnecessary desktop environments like this that are really heavy, it just bogs down the system a little bit, and those resources could be used elsewhere for something. Because it does use GNOME, we don't have access to like creating launchers directly. I know you can modify this and get launcher support. That's just extra tweaks that you have to do, which I'm not a huge fan of for any Linux distro, because like I said, I don't really want to mess around with tweaking the distro too much. I just want to do my work. I want to reverse engineer binaries. I want to develop software, create exploits, test things, and go on about my day without having to worry too much about the Linux OS. Yeah, what can I say? Ubuntu is still a solid distro, and it is a reality that we have to deal with. So you can't go wrong with it. Because of its support around the world, it's very easy to configure third-party drivers and software, and you'll be hard-pressed to find software and things that aren't readily supported by this OS. So being globally supported for most of the things that you're going to have to deal with, I would say Ubuntu is miles ahead of any other Linux distro. But because of their checkered past and resource heaviness for their desktop manager, it's not in my #1 spot, but it's something that, especially if you're working in a team environment, you're most likely going to have to use Ubuntu. So getting used to it working on your own or in team environment, you really can't go wrong. So I would recommend, with some caveats. Next up, we have a Linux distribution that not many people have probably heard of. It's called Peppermint Linux. The icon for it, in my opinion, is kind of dumb. The name for it, also a little dumb. But there's no denying that this thing is super fast. And it's very, very easy on resources. Normally when you get distributions that are easy on resources like this, they compromise on theming and other things that, maybe not have the greatest features in the desktop or the greatest look, but it's really quick. This kind of has both. They've done a phenomenal job with this distro. If we look at the resource utilization, this is in a VM, so hard booted, you get about 50 megs less than this normally. So it's normally sitting at about 330 megs of resource utilization, cold booted, and the number of tasks running is about 84. So tasks running is pretty low. The memory is certainly very, very low. And this, by default, is using the LXDE desktop environment, which is very easy on the resources. But normally with LXDE environments, they don't look that great. This one, they've actually done custom theming with, as you see with like the transparency of the windows, the layout of the menu, some of their custom tools and things. It's actually very, very nice. The quality of life thing that I always look for, you know, the desktop icons, you are able to create launchers, and I believe those allow you to drag and drop binaries to reverse engineering tools out of the box, which is great to not have to configure that. This distro also is based on Ubuntu/Debian, so you have access to readily available packages for frameworks and libraries and dependencies for other tools. And yeah, it's a great distro in my opinion. Very, very underrated and not very well known. But the Peppermint team has done a phenomenal job, you know, making this a very fast, easy to use operating system. And I hope they continue their work in the future. The only downside is because it's not as well known, you do run into some issues sometimes with because of their theming that they're doing with LXDE, which is, you know, looks great. Sometimes you have issues with applications not launching correctly or looking right, specifically like IDEs and Java and things like that. You can have some kind of issues with sometimes, but normally theming patches will allow you to work around those types of things. So if you're looking for a distro that is extremely light on resource usage, I would highly, highly recommend Peppermint. It's just, I've never had any issues with it as far as compatibility or anything like that. Packages are readily available, like I said, and super lightning quick. So highly recommend if you're looking for a lighter distribution. So our next Linux distribution is Kali Linux. What is there to say about Kali? It does just about everything. If you're not familiar with Kali is a very specific Linux distribution that's built for a very specific task. It goes back many, many years. It used to be called Backtrack Linux, and then they shifted over to, I think, another name and then Kali, or maybe it just went Backtrack to Kali. Either way, it comes pre-configured with an immense amount of security tools that they have categorized out for you. And there's even more tools that aren't listed in the menu. Yeah, there are an immense amount of security tools ranging from, you know, open source research to vulnerability analysis, fuzzing frameworks, exploitation frameworks, reverse engineering. I mean, you name it, there's something in here for that. It is the main distribution that is used by penetration testers and security teams that need to get very, you know, specific jobs done. However, it comes pre-configured with a lot of things that aren't necessarily good for running it as a daily distribution. Meaning, there's a lot of security considerations that, you know, if you're browsing around the internet and have this online on a network or public access and things like that, it may not be something that you want out there to have personal information on. It's meant to be a tool to be used for very specific things. So if you plan on using it for that, for development or reverse engineering, exploit development, it's great because it has, you know, all of these packages and things. By default, it comes with XFCE as the desktop environment, and it is running very low on resources. 526, you know, ish megs on a cold boot and 71 tasks. That's very low for most Linux distros. So that's great to see. Because it is using XFCE, we have access to creating launchers, which is great for dragging and dropping binaries onto reverse engineering tools. That's a great quality of life thing. One downside to security distros like this is because they come with all of these security packages, when you go to update, it's going to have updates for a lot of these tools, and that can get burdensome at times. You know, you have massive, 1 gig, 2 gig updates to update all the databases or security updates for these tools, and that can get a little annoying. But if you plan on, simply using this not as necessarily your daily driver, but using it for a tool to get a specific task done, whether that be reversing or developing normal software exploits, etc., Kali is a fantastic way to go. I think it's miles ahead of any other distribution out there that tries to mimic what Kali does, like ParrotOS or Black Arch. Those are two distributions that attempt to do the same thing Kali does. Kali just does it way better. They've been on the market much longer than those distros, and because of that, the community and support and tooling and configurations that they have built into Kali is just miles ahead, and it's a very, very solid distro for that specific tool use. Would highly recommend. And our last Linux distro is Linux Mint. What to say about Linux Mint? My number one pick for a go-to Linux distribution for software development, reverse engineering, binary analysis, exploit development, those types of things, and just being a daily driver for a Linux distribution. I started off this list with saying that I don't want a Linux distribution that requires a lot of customization to get it the way you want. I don't want a distribution that requires a million updates every couple days to stay, up to date with the bleeding edge software. And I don't want something that is incompatible due to a lack of support with a lot of applications, either the way they're launching or themed or running in, a newer desktop environment that doesn't have a whole lot of support across a whole lot of applications. And Linux Mint has that in spades. Linux Mint uses a desktop environment that they created called Cinnamon. While it's not the lightest out there, right now we see on a cold boot it's using about 780 megs, which, is on the higher side. Same with the tasks. Running is 102. This, definitely not the most resource efficient distro out there, but what it lacks in resource efficiency is made up in just a solid distribution. And by that I mean I've never had any issues with packages, dependencies, the Cinnamon desktop environment having issues with third-party applications. Everything just works. Their driver support for third-party drivers like video drivers, wireless drivers, Bluetooth, all of that, it just works. They have an immense repository for being compatible with old desktops and laptops as well as newer hardware. Yeah, there's no fussing around with it. There's no settings that you need to do as soon as you get into the desktop. As soon as you install it, you're ready to go. It'll ask you to do some updates, but that's the same with any Linux distro. Out of the box, the Cinnamon desktop environment comes with desktop launchers and things. So again, that's just a very small quality of life improvement that I really enjoy for reverse engineering. Being able to create those launchers and drag and drop binaries onto reverse engineering tools like IDA and Ghidra, Cutter, etc. Saves a lot of time, and that's much appreciated. In addition to having that kind of quality of life, just little improvements. Their menu system is also very well laid out. It's not overly cluttered. Everything is categorized neatly, so you can find things. You can also search for things very well, very quickly. Yeah, their Cinnamon desktop environment, I think, handles a very nice balance of offering features to you while not over complicating or adding too many customization options like I think KDE Plasma does. I love KDE Plasma, it's great, It's very resource efficient, but the sheer amount of customization you can do often gets in the way of just being able to work. So if your goal is to work, to do a very specific task, in this case, development, reverse engineering, exploit development, things like that, I would say Linux Mint is hands down the #1 distribution out there to just set it, forget it, do your work, apply some updates every now and then, and go about your business. They've never had any scandals that I'm aware of. They are based on Ubuntu, but they've forked off from Ubuntu because they disagree with a lot of things and direction that Ubuntu is going. And that's where we come up with this kind of simplified environment with the Cinnamon desktop. The ease of use, great support, great community, great hardware support as well. Just, in my opinion, it's a rock solid distribution that you can't go wrong with. And that's my #1 pick out of all the distributions I've tested for this type of work. So thanks for following along with this very long video. I wanted to share my once-a-year experiment with the community in hopes it may be informative. Many of the points that I bring up in regards to different Linux distributions may be controversial and it may upset some of the members of the community. However, many of the usability points I bring up are actually shared by Linus Torvalds himself. If you're unfamiliar with who Linus is, he's the developer of the Linux kernel. And if you're curious, you should definitely check out one of the videos of him that I have up on the screen. He gives great points and insights into why he dislikes most Linux desktop systems and how he thinks the OS should be. Overall, any of the distros listed here can be used as daily drivers and reverse engineering platforms with a bit of work. If you regularly use one of these distros and disagree with some of the assessments, let us know in the comments below. It's always great to get different perspectives on people's daily use of Linux. If y'all have any questions, hit us up at ringzerolabs.com.